Okay, so one of the ways we're going to look at prosperity on a per person basis is to create that per capita GDP. So per capita GDP. So sometimes I'll use a shortcut here, per capita PC. Per capita GDP is income per person on average. And so we get per capita GDP by taking our income. We can take real GDP, we could take nominal GDP even, and divide by the population. So that gives us our income per person that we can measure. All right, so question, does a 2% difference in economic growth really matter? So we're going to try to quantify this. So for example then, let's look at an economy that grows at 2%. So economic growth at 2% versus 4%. So suppose that real GDP per person, income per person, per capita GDP, is equal to 10,000 bucks. Which is about what it is in China, by the way, right now. China and India, they might be a little higher than that, 14,000 or something, but in other places around the world, we do have 10,000. In fact, one of these. Yeah, there it is. What's going on in the Ukraine right now? War. So this was from 1995 through 2017. The Ukraine had $7,907 of income per person. And the United States during that time frame had $54,000, right? So these are the income per person in different countries. So that kind of gives us one to be close to the 10,000 level. It's even a little bit under. I'm going to still use 10,000, but there's countries out there that's a big deal. Remember, that's been adjusted for purchasing power using real GDP and exchange rates. So it is 7,900 hamburgers versus 54,000 hamburgers when we compare it to the United States. All right, so suppose that's it. Using the rule of 70, how long will it take per capita income to double? So I'm sure this person making 10,000 would love to make 20,000, right? It'd be nice to double your income. Does anybody remember what the rule of 70 is? We did it a little bit in personal finance class, and you guys might have done it in some other classes. The rule of 70. It's kind of a rule of thumb, really. It's not super precise, but it gets us close enough to be dangerous to do some estimating. Anybody remember what that is? All right, here's the rule. The rule of 70 is that it's the number of years for something to double. The number of years for something to double in size, so to go from 10,000 to 20,000 in this example, that number of years is equal to 70 divided by the rate of growth. Divided by the rate of growth. So, in our example, at 2%, with the rate of change of per capita GDP growing at 2%, how long does it take your money to double when you live in that country? If you've got 2 and you don't do the 0.02, so this is pretty easy math. That's why we use it as a rule of thumb. 35, yeah. So 35 years, we're just going to take 70 divided by 2. So 70 divided by 2 equals 35 years to double to 20,000. Okay, so that's like pretty much doubling your guys' lifespans, right? So you're making 10,000 per year, and you're going to be making 20,000 a year 35 years from now. How much is it if I'm in a 4% growth country? Justin's got his calculator out. What did you get, Justin? 17.5, right. So for the 4%, so at 4%, you got 70 divided by 4 equals 17.5 years. So is the little bitty 2% a big deal? Well, it is, right? In terms of your purchasing power and what you can do, what you can buy, and how quickly that's going to turn into something that's, relevant to you. 2% growth matters. So now we think, are there ways that we can squeeze another 2% growth? Anybody remember what the growth rate turned out to be that was a little below expectations from the article we did last week? Real GDP growth for the first quarter? Tim? 3.4. No, that was the inflation estimate, and then inflation ended up being 3.7. So it was worse than expected, and so was GDP. 1.6%. So 1.6, and I think they were expecting 1.9 or something. Maybe it was even over 2. I can't remember, but it was below expectations. So the U.S. economy grew at 1.6. The previous 2 quarters prior to that or something, it had grown at 4%. So how can we kind of raise that up? And we want to think long term for this, right? It doesn't matter if it's 1.6 to 4 and we're averaging. We're thinking about what is the long-term average growth rate. Having policies of economic freedom in place can start to raise that from a 2 to a 4 and have some real impact. Okay, questions or comments on that? So that's rule of 70. All right, so let's put on here the major sources of growth. All right, so sources of growth, major sources of long-term growth. So number one are gains from trade. Gains from trade. This is what we did in the first week of class when we had Japan and the United States with food and cars. Remember the gains from trade we calculated by allowing people to trade? And did I do the trade game with you guys? Was that in micro, where we traded the candy? So trading the candy is also a way of showing the gains from trade. And so there's kind of two ways to think about this one as it relates to economic freedom. You want to get gains from trade. So gains from trade are increases in value from allowing more trade. And they come to us within our country and then using international trade. So there's kind of two cases for this. So we have domestic trade among citizens, well, and not as citizens. The population doesn't really matter who's in there, but let's just say among citizens anyway, of the USA. So we've got within your, within your state, within the nation. And so one of the measures in the Economic Freedom Index is those regulations. So remember we talked about hair salons and cutting hair, and the more things we have to kind of restrict trade amongst ourselves will reduce the possibility of gains from trade. So domestic trade, so here in the index, so kind of key point, regulations, licenses, labor laws will reduce trade, and therefore the gains from trade. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, and then the second part of this would be international trade, which was a different category of the 5 categories of economic freedom. So international trade, so I guess we could put a little A and B here. Domestic trade and B, international trade. So international trade is our ability to trade with people around the world freely. So there's a less gains when there are trade restrictions country to country. So in that chapter, we talked about quotas and tariffs and maybe some other regulation. Restricting international trade. So it's kind of the same thing. We want to be able to trade with our brothers and sisters around the world. Okay, number 2 on our major sources then is entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship is different than like management, right? Sometimes the entrepreneur is going to be a manager and have to tell people when they can clock in and when they can clock out and how to do something. But I want you to think of management as a distinct, different type of task or role compared to the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is bringing the new thing to the table, the technology. So the entrepreneur brings innovation and new technology, innovation, new technology, and discovery of new ways to produce. And so again, regulations, licensing, other restrictions, labor laws, how long it takes to get a license, all of those will tend to reduce entrepreneurship. So the key point is regulations and restrictions create barriers to entrepreneurship. So there might be an attorney that needs to be hired. So you thought about doing a new business, but it turns out there's $5,000 of attorney fees that you need to get it going, and you're like, that's not worth it. I'll just stay at my current job, right? And not be willing to take on that new thing. Okay, so you guys aren't very good at whispering. You got something to share, or otherwise be quiet. Okay. All right, number 3 on our list is physical capital. Number 3. So here we've got investment in physical capital. So machines instead of beer, pizza, and wings. So investment in physical capital, work experience, and human capital. What's the idea of human capital in economics? Human capital. You got physical capital being machines. What do we mean when we're talking about human capital? Yeah?
Knowledge and skills.
Knowledge and skills. So something about the human mind, right? So we're bringing in you through maybe education and work experience. So human capital in general is improvements to the mind and body of humans to be more productive. So we use the word human capital as opposed to just like knowledge or information or whatever. So whenever we've got this word there, we're kind of relating it back to the production process. So how do we get that? Through education and work experience and other things. We're building up our human capital base, right? So it's these enhancements to labor is the idea of human capital. And in countries where there's less economic freedom, there tends to be less investments in human capital. So we looked at the chart yesterday had education levels was another subtopic of education levels in different countries. So more economic freedom, more econ freedom leads to more human capital investment, like education. Okay, so I have another video we're going to check out, but before we do that, I want to make sure we're clear on what developed versus less developed or low developing country is. So your textbook's got a nice little definition. A less developed country. So otherwise known as a developing country. So it's kind of just a loose term. And what are some things going on of describing a lesser developed country? What are some things that you would describe them as? You look at that country, oh, that's a lesser developed country than the United States or whatever. Justin?
Would that be like, back in the day, there sounds like lower income?
Yeah, definitely lower income. So, lower income and per capita income. Now let me pause right there, because there's been so many mistakes over time, and I, by the way, completely agree with you, Justin, that that's the first thing we look at, lower income, but then what's the next natural thing that you want to do to help this country? What do they need? Business, good. You're starting to bridge the gap there, but if it's a low income per person, how can I help out this country? What do I need to give them? Give them some money, give them some income, right? Through a gift or something. And that's where we go wrong of putting the cart and the horse in different spots. What we've learned through all the economic freedom stuff is that you need economic freedom to get the result of the higher income. You can't just shortcut it and give people the income. Those international aid programs like we talked about and some other things end up not being sustainable for the long run. Of course, it's going to put some food in somebody's stomach today and whatever, for a limited time, but it sometimes doesn't do that, actually. I'm reading a book, it's an audio book, so I'm technically listening to it, called The Dictator's Handbook. And it's just really reinforcing around the world what a disaster it is to give countries money and aid, because the dictators and the autocrats who run the country are able to basically not get it to where it should be going. And so then there's been, we don't want to spend too much more class time saying that, but that is not the answer in general for sustainably bringing up people's income. All right, so the couple other things though, we have less education. So low levels of education. Again, an outcome of having economic freedom in place is that it leads to more income and the ability to generate more income for yourselves. Widespread illiteracy. which kind of goes with the education part. And widespread use of production methods largely absent in developed countries.
Can you elaborate a bit more on that one?
Sure. So, why do we see people still plowing their field with a horse or a cow, a bull, cattle, whatever, plowing the field in India and in Guatemala and other places, right? Do we see that happening in the United States? Only in the Amish communities or people who choose to not use the technology. So why do we see that production going on when it's like, well, why don't you just use a tractor? And of course, so part of that is you can't afford a tractor, right? And how do we do that? But again, if I just give a tractor, that's not necessarily going to be the sustainable element for the long term. It could, with the tractor's case, could be a good way to help people pull themselves out of poverty, but not necessarily the nation. And so it kind of gives this perception of, well, are the developed countries, again, taking advantage of the lesser developed countries? But when we step back and look at it, that might have helped them raise their income by being able to do with what they had at their means, right? To be able to work with what they had at the time to make more corn, to sell more corn internationally or whatever the case is. All right, so those are just kind of some things we see in developing countries of that, and that's the connection back to our economic freedom. All right, so we're going to look at Venezuela a little closer today. So Venezuela, you might remember, is the poster child currently of what not to do with your country and the 5 areas of economic freedom. All right, let's see. So on your papers, if you can put on Venezuela, and for this one, I want you to now start to see what is missing in Venezuela. What part of economic freedom is not there?
I'm JT, and I'm a Gold Hunter, the search engine for conservatives. Let me just tell you what it does. First of all, big...
Okay, so for this one, what is missing in Venezuela of the elements from economic freedom? All right, so here we go.
The president says he has a mandate.
The people of this nation have spoken.
That means his government can do all sorts of good things.
We can ban assault weapons.
Gun control's on the agenda. And many progressives also want to outlaw hate speech.
Hate speech is fundamentally at odds with the Constitution.
And above all, they'll spend much more of your money.
Without creating an inflation problem.
Sounds great, except those policies were just tried in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez thrilled American celebrities by embracing not just socialism, but the very ideas they'd advocated.
This is you and Hugo Chavez.
Help me write my speech.
Here's one of the most important forces we've had on this planet.
You have to be black to actually believe that.
Andres Gilarte is one of the thousands of Venezuelans who protested socialist rule. Here he is with his friends. They risked their lives to protest.
Undeterred by security forces, participants flood the streets of Caracas.
You also have like a war actually. And you're running from bullets and you're running from tear gas.
The government killed hundreds of protesters. Yet the protests continued for months. because those very policies that American celebrities love created horrible hardships.
We can't take it anymore.
Now even basic protest is often illegal because Venezuela passed a hate speech law.
The law bans Venezuelans from spreading violent or hateful content through TV, radio, or social media platforms.
Yet that's exactly what half the Democrats in America now want.
Free speech is protected, hate speech is not protected.
A ban on hate speech may sound good, but the problem is,
The ruling party, they decide what hate speech is.
in America, some politicians in the ruling party also want to add 4 new justices to the Supreme Court.
A 32-member Supreme Court.
Chavez did that, his Supreme Court,
They changed it from 20 people to 32 people.
and the court has never ruled against it.
After that, no.
Venezuela also passed gun control laws, something else America's ruling party would like to do. But in Venezuela, people discovered that taking people's guns also makes it easier for the government to come to your home and take your property.
See how it actually happens. So you're just in your shop selling shoes, and some government officer arrives and say, "We're gonna shut down your business." That would be completely different if that business owner had a gun.
But the government would just come in with bigger guns.
If we actually had a culture like we have here in the US, it would have been incredibly difficult.
And the restrictions on guns didn't even reduce crime. In fact, Venezuela's murder rate rose.
These laws never work. Citizens don't have guns, but the criminals have the bigger guns.
The most important lesson from Venezuela is probably the danger in the idea that governments can fund everything they want to do by simply printing more money.
The federal government, it can never run out of money. It never has to worry about finding the money in order to be able to spend.
There is no financial limit.
Or spending won't create inflation, we're told. It'll do the opposite.
Driving down prices, not raising prices.
There's a new movement in America that we can just print more money and it won't cause problems, won't cause inflation. It'll just stimulate.
Well, of course, that's how economy works. You just print money because money comes out from the trees.
Venezuela printed that money and spent it on programs they said would help the poor.
His supporters say that Chavez is the country's first president to genuinely care about the lower class.
But the poor were the people hurt most by the inflation that followed.
Cost of most basic goods has soared.
The oil-rich country's inflation rate at 270%.
Inflation expected to hit 700% this year.
400,000%.
1,000,000%.
Inflation's up in the United States too, and the direction looks ugly. But inflation here hasn't exploded the way it did in Venezuela.
It doesn't mean that it can happen.
That, unfortunately, is true. Remember, Venezuela was once very rich.
We were the richest economy in Latin America. We were the promised land. People from America were going to Venezuela to build businesses.
But now, Venezuelans try to escape.
Carrying their lives on their backs.
Everything can fall to the ground really quickly. Inflation is like a cancer. You never know when it's going to hit them.
The idea that massive government spending and all those other feel-good policies will work in America when they've already failed elsewhere. That's a dangerous myth.
Alright, so jot down what's missing. I'm going to pull up the economic freedom stuff. Maybe. What am I looking for here? There we go. All right. From the video, what of these 5 areas, why is Venezuela scoring so low from what we heard in the video? What were some of these areas? We got size of government, legal system and protection of property rights, access to sound money, freedom to trade internationally, and then regulations of business and capital. Which ones did Venezuela go wrong on? Arthur? Number 2. All right, what did you see in the video that made you say that one?
The fact that the government made protests illegal.
Okay. Yeah, so having the protests be illegal. Okay, Justin, you got something to add there?
It'd be the same thing for the number 2, but the, like they said, with taking away guns, they could also just come to your house and be like, take your property as well as just the protection of property.
Yeah. Yeah, so the gun thing, you know, I don't want to have a big gun debate or anything. I sometimes don't have terribly strong feelings about it, but I will say the original reason why they established the right to bear arms was to protect ourselves against the government in the United States, right? Because we kind of came off of a system where government was big, and so that was the original thing. And of course, we are where we are today, and we'd like to think it wouldn't ever be us against the government, but it's happened in all the Venezuela case shows. Is it's happened there. It's happened in other countries too. So we don't want to be so conceited in the United States that we think, oh, it could never happen to us. You know, again, I don't think it's going to happen to us. I don't want to be. I'm not trying to be fear-mongering, but you got to look at the data. That's what I do. You look at the information in other places. So, Tim.
One is also happened with the increase in size of the government.
Okay, yeah, that's what. Yeah, there are other ones we need to hit here. So, size of government. What came out of the video of what Venezuela did with their Chavez, their leader, that kind of led to the size of government. So, Tim, I'll let you continue on here if you want.
He increased from 20 to 32, I think, members in the board, isn't it?
Okay, now that one, I would say, isn't so much related to the size of government for that one, but that's more on some of the regulations and the legal system. So the legal system, by putting additional people in, they could vote, they could create a majority to vote with whatever Chavez wanted to do. So that is kind of altering the rule of law on the court packing thing a little bit. Justin? That's what you're going to say too? Okay. So back to the size of government. He did something else though with the programs. Where did government spending increase? Who was he trying to help, at least through his rhetoric and his speeches?
The poor.
The poor. And so a lot of government programs, I mean, it was crazy. When they finally went broke, the price of rice was like, let's say, the equivalent of 10 cents. The market price of rice was $2. And so as soon as the government went broke and they couldn't subsidize, they could no longer print money to do that because they were having that program, then the market price of rice jumped from $2. And here everybody can't probably afford much of the 10-cent rice, but they couldn't do it anymore. So the printing off of money is number 3, right? So creating inflation through printing money really picks on area number 3 for Venezuela. So long story short, Venezuela scores low on all of these areas. There's nothing it's strong in. Freedom to trade internationally. So they used their oil reserves. So it's a very oil-rich country, and so they would have restrictions even on where they sold that to. They were kind of supporting Cuba as an ally over time. But we get people kind of romanticizing that the bigger government taking care of the people is the way to go. And again, time and time again, the evidence breaks down against that argument. Okay, so any last questions or comments? By the way, the Republicans don't do much better at some of that stuff than the Democrats, so that one was a little politically charged, but there's more to talk about on both sides. So both sides are growing the size of government. Some maybe faster than others, but don't think that Republicans don't do the same thing. That we need to kind of overhaul the whole system, which probably isn't going to happen. But now you guys got exposed to at least some of the areas that are important. We'll see you tomorrow. So make sure your first name, last name's on there.